Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Beginning in 2011, New Yorkers by overwhelming margins elected Andrew Cuomo as their governor for 3 successive 4-year terms. His stewardship had all the elements of Greek tragedy: the reversal of fortune, the fall from grace. In early 2020, his approval rating soared to 77%, an all-time high. He earned a national reputation for his straightforward handling of the COVID crisis, as well as his completion of the Second Avenue subway and LaGuardia Airport projects. The next year, he found himself hounded out of office by political enemies, accusing him of sexual harassment and of concealing damaging data about COVID deaths in nursing homes. Melissa DeRosa is with us, chief of staff to Andrew Cuomo during most of his time in office. Melissa has written a scorching Take No Prisoners book entitled What's Left Unsaid, in which she vividly depicts the blood sport of Albany politics. Kirkus calls her book an angry, raw, and briskly told memoir. And The Guardian says she punches hard. Her anger is white hot. We're pleased to welcome Melissa DeRosa to the program. Well, congratulations on your book, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate you reading it.
Well, I was delighted to read it. It was a very interesting book. Now, I always like to start with titles, and what's left unsaid? What was left unsaid? I thought I knew everything about this subject.
Well, you know, when I was trying to come up with the title of the book, I thought about the purpose in writing the book. And really, I wrote the book because I felt like the first draft of history, which was told in the media, done not through primary sources, was completely distorted and wrong. And so I was putting forward the second draft of history, told by a primary source, someone who was in the room, someone who has lived it, someone who knew what they were talking about. And I decided the best title was What's Left Unsaid, because it was all of the things that hadn't been represented in the media or had been distorted. So that was the origin of the title.
Well, you couldn't entitle it The Room Where It Happened because John Bolton had already taken it.
That's right. You beat me to it.
Beat you to it. So did you write the book to get even?
No, I decided to write the book 24 hours out of office. Literally, within 24 hours of the governor being out of office, I said to myself, I'm going to write this book. And I did it for a very simple reason. I felt a responsibility. I felt a responsibility to the public at large, but specifically the people of New York. I felt a responsibility to my administration, who I felt was so unfairly treated during the final years while we were in office, some of the greatest public servants ever to be in office, and a responsibility to my family and myself to tell the truth and to get the truth out there so that people don't have to rely on distorted, biased, slanted reports in the press, but can read for themselves what happened during a very dark period in our country's history during COVID, and then during the successive year where it was a really dark history in politics, where I believe an attorney general's office was weaponized to overturn a governor.
Let's just backtrack a minute. When you got there in Albany, you weren't writing on a blank slate. You had a political background. Why don't you tell us something about your background and how you came to work for Andrew Cuomo?
Sure. So I grew up in the halls of government. My father started in the union movement out in Rochester, New York. He worked for GM, General Motors, on an assembly line, and then he got it to work with UAW, which is the United Auto Workers. From there, he worked for a woman named Louise Slaughter, who was a member of Congress. And then, you know, his career sort of took him through various public service and political positions. And I was fascinated from the time I was a child by the heady world that was public service. And I was taken by government's ability to enact massive change that impacted the greatest number of people. And, you know, government creates civil rights, and we build literal bridges. We send troops off to war to defend democracy. And there, to me, there's nothing more incredible than that. And so from the time I was a kid, I was fascinated by it. When I was 16 years old, I interned for the political director of the AFL-CIO. When I was 19, I interned for Hillary Clinton when she was a US Senator, first, you know, female senator from New York. I went to Cornell University. I graduated and bounced around to various governmental and political positions, including working for Barack Obama, running his state political operation, deputy chief of staff and then subsequently chief of staff to New York Attorney General under Eric Schneiderman. And then I went into the Cuomo orbit in 2013 as comms director. And from there, I quickly rose. Communications director. And from there, I quickly rose through the ranks. I became chief of staff, and then subsequently I was appointed secretary to the governor, which is a constitutional position. It is the most powerful unelected official in the state of New York. And I was the first woman to get appointed to that position. So it was a glass ceiling moment. I was 34. It was everything that I had worked for. I accomplished it at a very young age. And from there, we took on things like COVID and scandal and crisis, and it's all in the book.
But you were a staff person, really. You weren't elected, you weren't a line person. There's a distinction between staff and line, but yet you were thought of as the most powerful person in Albany. How do you reconcile all those roles?
It's funny because I always thought of myself exactly as you said, as a staff person. I was a behind the scenes person. I managed the government. I managed our senior staff. I helped set our policy agenda, but I was a staffer. And COVID changed all of that. Those 111 days that Governor Cuomo and I and a couple of other staff people spent doing those nationally televised press conferences, suddenly overnight, it was like I was catapulted from unknown staff person to being a household name, which was something I never signed up for. And with that came a lot of positive attention and ink and fanfare, but it also came with a giant target on my back. And when you get to that level in politics and people are paying attention to you and talking about you and you're getting plaudits, you also need to brace yourself because the other side is coming. And so I experienced in those 2 years sort of catapulting from a relative unknown to becoming, someone who was very well known nationally and then someone who became the target of a very angry press corps.
Let's talk about Andrew Cuomo for a minute.
Sure.
Most people would say that he has a baleful countenance. He's sort of sorrowful in affect. He's mean-spirited. He's nasty. People didn't like him. Dick Ravitch said he was hated in Albany. Others have said, Liz Smith said he was just terrible to other people. What was he like to work with?
He was none of those things. Look, could he be a tough boss, a demanding boss? Absolutely. If you were on the other side of him while he was trying to get the Tappan Zee Bridge rebuilt or the Second Avenue subway rebuilt or marriage equality passed, and you were trying to stop him and he was the person you were up against, were you going to like him at the end of it? Maybe not. But he didn't care because to him, being in government meant actually producing results for real people. And so if that meant having to have sharp elbows at certain moments or twisting arms at certain moments, he didn't care. He was there because he worked for the people. And these caricatures that were portrayed of him over the years, primarily by political opponents, they're sort of laughable. Nobody's one-dimensional. Everybody's three-dimensional. And the people who were closest to him that worked for him knew that. I certainly knew that. His family knows that. But also when he was in the office, or he was in the Capitol, he had a job to do. And he was very clear in his purpose and his dedication, 24 hours a day, very intense, very goal-oriented. And so that's who he was. And over time, when you're doing that, you tend to alienate people who would frankly otherwise rather be left alone.
Well, he was an inspiration to all of us during COVID. I remember that quite vividly, that while Trump was telling me to drink Clorox, Cuomo was giving me the facts, and that's really what I wanted. But there were two elements that brought him down. One was the undercounting of deaths in nursing homes, allegedly, and the other was the sexual harassment scandal. Both were kind of authored by Letitia James, who wanted to be governor, who was his rival, but picked up on by the media without question. But would you agree that if it hadn't been for the sexual harassment element, the nursing home problem was a tempest in a teapot and really wouldn't have amounted to anything?
100%. You said it perfectly. New York was one of 11 states that had a very similar readmissions policy on COVID during the deadliest months of the pandemic when, you're making wartime decisions trying to keep the hospital system from collapsing. So why was it that just New York and New Jersey and Michigan and Pennsylvania were targeted by Trump's Department of Justice? And the answer was it was politics. And the Fox News and the New York Post really honed in on it and capitalized on it. It became sort of this clarion call for the far right. But I mean, look at the other governors who went through sort of the same paces on nursing homes. Murphy got reelected, Whitmer got reelected. There's no doubt in my mind that would not have impacted the governor's reelection. And I think most people saw that for what it was, which was a weaponization of real pain for political purposes. But the sexual harassment report and what I believe is a manufactured scandal was too much to withstand, particularly with the Democratic Party and with a giddy press corps that was not really properly vetting or investigating any of it.
Okay, but before we get to sex, let's just talk about nursing homes. The total deaths in the state were never undercounted, were they?
Never.
So it's a question of the allocation between deaths in nursing homes and deaths in hospitals.
That's right.
Now, maybe you can amplify that a little more to show how that thing went off the rails.
Sure. So when COVID first began in March of 2020, well, by the way, unbeknownst to us, it had really been here since January, but when we became aware of its presence in New York in March of 2020, the federal government didn't provide states with any guidance on a lot of things, but particularly on how it counted deaths. And in New York, we made the decision from day one that we were going to do it very simply. Hospitals reported who died in the hospitals, nursing homes reported who died in the nursing homes. And we did it because it was the most effective and reliable. We were in real time. We were asking people to give us numbers so we could give things to the public. And then about a month and a half into the pandemic, the press corps starts asking for a different number, which is, what about the people who were in nursing homes and went to hospitals and died? And so I talk about this in the book. We went through this process where we started issuing all of these retroactive surveys and asking nursing homes to go back and try to account for what happened to their patients when they left. We also asked them to tell us who probably died of COVID. This concept of probables was introduced, which ironically, New York was one of only 11 states in the country that did probables. They reported probables. And we were actually accused by Donald Trump at the time of inflating New York's deaths to make him look bad. So the idea that there was ever an issue with undercounting is sort of laughable when you put it in that context. But so in any event, that's where the issue was. The overall total deaths was never in question. The question became, what about the people who were in nursing homes at one point, left, went to hospitals, and died in hospitals? And that number became politicized.
So were they toted up as deaths in nursing homes or deaths in hospitals? And really, last analysis, what difference does it make?
I mean, your words, not mine. but I mean, look, it was, again, it was something that was weaponized and politicized. No one, questioned that people who were elderly died at a higher rate. That was the case.
But they were more
nationwide.
susceptible to dying.
They were more susceptible to dying. This was an illness that impacted immunocompromised and the elderly. But at the end of the day, what sort of gets lost in the fog of COVID is that every state in the country that has looked at this has concluded the same thing, which is that nursing home patients died because COVID entered nursing homes through staff and through visitors who didn't know that they had COVID at the time in those early months before we knew about asymptomatic spread and other things.
And there wasn't testing in the early days.
And there wasn't testing.
If I wanted to go into a nursing home, I just walked in.
That's right. That's right. And 6 weeks into the pandemic, and I think it was May 14th in the pandemic, so we first found our first COVID case on March 1st, we said you have to be tested twice weekly, the staff, and everyone has to, if they want to go back into the nursing home, they have to be tested. So the amount of time that policy was even in place was so compact, but it didn't matter, and the facts didn't matter, and that was one of the great tragedies, was that I think there was so much real pain that was weaponized for politics, and it never really communicated.
Well, you were accused of a cover-up because there was a Trump Justice Department investigation, and you were accused of concealing deaths in nursing homes so that you'd come out better with the Trump Justice Department. What was that all about?
That was the New York Post at its finest. That was a leaked transcript.
I wouldn't say finest.
At their most effective. That was a leaked transcript from a closed-door meeting that I had held with legislators where I was trying to explain to them this complicated issue around the numbers. And I had used the words froze and pause interchangeably. And I said we got subpoenaed by the federal Justice Department at Trump's direction, we believed. And we froze. But then the next sentence I said, and so we went to the legislature and said, we're going to put your request for these numbers on pause while we respond to the Trump Justice Department. And the New York Post did what it did. It said that I admitted in a closed-door meeting to obstructing justice, to hide criminal activity so that, they couldn't come after us for wrongdoing in the nursing homes, when it was the exact opposite of what I said. And in July of 2021, we actually received a letter from the Justice Department saying, we reviewed the numbers that you turned over, and there's nothing here to investigate. So not only were the numbers accurate, but it didn't demonstrate that there was anything going on in New York that wasn't seen in any of the other states that would have pointed to an issue on that March 25th policy. And so, but it was too late. The die had been cast, the narrative had been hardened, and that was one of the things I learned over and over again as I write in my book. The lesson I learned, if you don't defend yourself in real time, if you don't correct the record, if you don't get out in front of these things, it's impossible to ever undo.
Okay, so that's a great slide into sex. I promised you we'd get to sex. Letitia James announced that she was investigating allegations of sexual harassment, particularly 11 women. And of course, 11 women is worse than one woman. But you didn't get out in front of that investigation, did you?
Well, and it's funny. So it didn't start as 11 women. It started off as there were two women, this woman, Lindsay Boylan, and this woman, Charlotte Bennett. Both had made these claims publicly around sexual harassment, and we believed at the time the only way to deal with it was to call for an independent investigation. And we had actually reached out to this woman, Barbara Jones, who has been a judge for a very long time, is above reproach, actually has been since selected to oversee various DOJ investigations dealing with Trump. But at the time, the legislature wanted their good pal, Tish James, to be in charge of the investigation. And she was organizing people behind the scenes, saying, it has to be me. He's disrespecting a black woman who's in office. And they created this political pressure where if we did not immediately give her the ability to investigate us, then the legislature was going to move to impeach. So with a gun to our head, literally, we allowed Tish James to take over this investigation. And I write about it in the book where I actually said to the legislative leaders, my counterparts, I said, we will take any lawyer in New York, but we're not doing Tish James. And they said, it is what it is, you have to. So she comes in, she refused to rule out that she was running for governor. We said, we'll let you do the investigation under the predicate that you choose truly independent prosecutors to run it, with no history involving us, the office, and no plaintiff's attorneys, who we believed would be incentivized to build a case as opposed to doing an honest investigation. And what does she do? She chooses June Kim, who had a long history of investigating our office with his good pal Preet Bharara, and a woman by the name of Ann Clark, who runs a plaintiff's firm. So it was the exact opposite of what she had agreed to do. And from there, we were off to the races. I mean, it started off as these two allegations. And then the report comes out on August 3rd, 2021, and the number was 11. And I tell the story in the book of when I get the phone call from Rich Azzopardi, who was our comms director, senior advisor, communications director, senior advisor. And he said, she's saying 11 women. And I was like, 11 women? What are you talking about? And he says, I've never even heard of half of these people. And it was, she had used and abused her office in the investigation in order to take out a political rival.
Well, two of them didn't even work for the state of New York.
Two of them didn't work for the state of New York.
A number of the allegations were very trivial.
3 of the women said under oath they weren't sexually harassed, so that's 5. Let's knock those out. I actually say 6 because one she claims was a state contractor, although to this day she's never identified that person. So anyone who talks about due process, you're kidding yourself. So let's put those 6 aside. And then when you look at the remaining 5, they don't stand up. You know, this was weaponizing trivial interactions, a kiss on the cheek, putting your hand on someone's waist for a photograph. Stuff I see Kathy Hochul and Tish James doing every day today in politics. And so it was just...
Even Joe Biden.
Joe Biden, you know, and so it was just a moment of sheer lunacy.
Now, what do you make of it seems to me, the double standard of the Democratic politicians? I mean, we see the Democrats standing up for Bob Menendez, gold bars in the House and large sums of cash. And he's there still in the Senate. You see the Republican politicians standing up for Santos, amazing, indicted, and then a superseding indictment, and they vote not to evict him from the Senate, from the House, and even Jamie Raskin voted for Santos. I mean, you see a double standard here, but Schumer called for Cuomo to resign before the report was even out. And then the report came out, and Biden, who hadn't read the report, called for him to resign. I mean, why this piling on Andrew Cuomo?
I talk about this in the book, and I said, you know, when it comes to calls for resignation, the public should always be very wary, because generally speaking, you can draw a straight line from someone's call to resignation to their political interests. And Chuck Schumer, you know, had disdained Andrew Cuomo for years and years, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the allegations that were out there. He saw his chance to take his shot at a political rival, and he took it. And as far as Joe Biden is concerned, Joe Biden had been accused of sexual assault by Tara Reade, and very quickly 7 other women came out and accused him of varying levels of harassment, misconduct. And you know, in my view, I think the White House made a calculated decision in that moment that if we don't separate ourselves from this very quickly, it could come back on us. And they could revisit all the allegations against us, which at the time, members of the media didn't go near, because he was running against Trump and no one wanted to do anything that could harm his election chances. And so it was all politics. It was politics everywhere you looked. And it is something that to this day blows my mind that the press does not go back and take a look at, because this was the weaponization of the Attorney General's office to take out a political rival and overturn a duly elected governor, and people should care about that.
Now, of course, early on, Cuomo issued a statement where he endorsed the investigation by Tish James and said he was going to cooperate with it, and that it was a very good investigation. He was glad there was going to be this investigation. He was confident he'd be exonerated. Do you think that was naive and ill-advised?
No, it was neither of those things. It was buying time. I mean, look, maybe people don't
so
want to hear that.
Why didn't he say, let's wait and see what she says? I'm confident we can refute anything that's adverse. I mean, why did he seem to say, you know, whatever she finds, I'll abide by? Was that just to mollify the legislature?
It was to mollify the legislature and the press. And it was an attempt in a moment in time to take the temperature down. It was so hot every day. It was a struggle to just get to the end of the day. And so he was saying what we believed the legislature and the press wanted and needed to hear in order to get to the next day. And I look back on that period of time, and we never should have given her the authority. We should have taken our chances with the legislature. We would have, I believe, at that point, gotten better due process there than what happened with her one-sided farce of a report. But these were decisions being made by sleep-deprived people, dealing with COVID, dealing with crisis, dealing with scandal. And, you know, there's a lot of things that at the time we did that when I look back on it, I say, if only.
If only. But of course, there's one allegation you haven't touched on, and it's a touching allegation. It's the state trooper and his protective detail who says he touched her once on the stomach. I mean, maybe it was inadvertent, maybe it wasn't. What's your answer to that?
Well, it's interesting. You know, that state trooper sued me, which, as I write in the book, it was an interesting thing to be sued by a woman who herself under oath said she never talked to me or had any interactions with me. But that gives you a sense at the level of lunacy that this all reached, was that this woman represented by Wigdor, which is this notorious plaintiff's firm that has been previously accused of using the media to extract financial settlements out of, that she was suing me, someone that she had never engaged with. But the trooper was very complicated, and that was the one that sort of tipped everything over at the end, because everyone said, oh, well, if a state trooper. So they didn't even consider the facts or what she was saying. And it's funny, I was on Bill Maher a week and a half ago, and he sort of broke down some of the stuff about the trooper, and he's like, oh, you touched your back in an elevator and said, hey, you kissed me on the cheek, this is what we're talking about. But no one drilled down on what the allegations were even. And while I was in the trooper lawsuit, I decided, well, I'm here. I was dismissed, just to be clear for
I knew that.
Yes, I was dismissed from the lawsuit because I should never have been there to begin with. But while I was in
You
the
didn't
lawsuit,
pat her on the stomach.
I did not. While I was in the lawsuit, I told myself, you know what? I'm going to sit in on these depositions. So I sat in on the depositions, and I watched as these male troopers came in and said, oh, yeah, he would kiss me on the cheek. Oh, yeah, he would pat me on the stomach as he would walk by me and I was opening the door. It was his affectionate way of saying, like, I see you, pat you on the, the shoulder, pat you on the stomach, like, pat you on the back. And there was nothing sexual about it. There was nothing sexual about it.
Is there a chance we're going to see him again in politics, that he'll run for governor next time around?
That's a question for him, but I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it. I think that he's looking around at the state of the city, the state of the state, the state of the country, and as someone who loves public service and government, I think that he is flummoxed by the lack of leadership at every level, and I just don't see him sitting this out for the rest of his life.
And if he were to be elected, would you accept an appointment as his chief of staff?
I would support him any way that I could, but it's time for me to chart my own course and figure out my own life.
Chart your own course. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for coming by. This has been really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Meanwhile, take care, be well, and all the best.